Because there's an element of insecurity and sort of cognitive dissonance involved. Theory really has to inform practice. It's not the other way around.
We'd like to welcome back Dr Andrew McLean again to Horse Chats. Now, Andrew's been on before. We've got him back because he's an equitana educator and he's along the series of being an equitana educator. But if you'd like to find out a bit more about Andrew before you start this chat, just go back to 003 and 0111. And the reason we had him on as 003 is because I wanted the first three chats to be the world's top experts, and I consider Andrew to be one of the world's top experts. Now, he's going to, at Equitana, talk along with Kathleen Kinder and Rachel Edwards about the Pony Club new curriculum. And if anyone's had a look at the new curriculum, the last little while, you've got to see that the Pony Club curriculum is based on evidence-based and ethical training methods, and just such a refreshing look at training and training kids and just getting them started with horses. And I think Andrew is going to correct me. I think there's like about 8 different levels. But before we introduce Andrew, I'd just like to remind you that the podcast brought to you by International Horse College, and the mission of International Horse College is to improve the welfare of horses around the world through safe education of their riders, handlers and trainers. So have a look now at the wide variety of horse courses incorporating horse welfare and safety around horses at International Horse College. Registered Training Organisation 31352. Now, Andrew, who we're going to introduce in a moment, is a pivotal figure in the introduction of equitation science into the Pony Club Australia's curriculum. He is a current patron of Pony Club Australia, and he's played a crucial role in developing this new syllabus, which, as I said before, emphasises evidence-based and ethical training methods. And he'll tell you that the approach focuses on understanding equine behaviour, learning theory and biomechanics to ensure rider safety and horse welfare, which is what we're all about. So, Andrew, are you there?
I am, yes.
Oh, welcome back to Horse Chats.
Thank you.
Andrew, you know that we normally talk to people and invite them on and talk about their inspirational quote, just at the beginning so that we can get to know them a bit better. Now, the last time or another time when you're on, might have been the first time, you did talk about an inspirational quote, which I loved, which was, "Kindness is a language which the deaf can hear and the blind can see." Is that the one you want to talk about today, or have you got something else for us?
Well, that one still really moves me. I think it's so important because it's not just about horses, it's about how we deal with one another. And especially in this world at the moment, it's so polarized that it's more important than ever to talk about being kind to people. And amongst all this polarization is the effects of social media, which can, there's some good aspects to it, but there's also some pretty bad aspects to it in terms of people's, health and safety. So I have another quote that I thought I'd move on with today, because it was a quote that really changed my life and helped me understand more about what I should be doing in training in the very early days. So I was working in France and I did some work with Michel Henriquet, who's now passed away, and he was at one time the most outstanding of the French sort of classical trainers, and a very nice human being as well. And he was teaching a Portuguese team of dressage riders who were, using their hands a bit too much and making the horses rounder and all of that sort of thing. And this is really before roll cur and hyperflexion came around. And he was shouting at them saying, no, their head and neck is a consequence of the legs. Do you hear me? It's a consequence. So do not touch the face. Let the horse's head melt into the right position. And although I'd felt the same way, it really suddenly sort of crystallized what I was thinking and where I wanted to head, because it is true that if you get the horse really light to the stop and go aids and turning as well, because if they're not good at turning, they'll lean on one rein. And it is about turn when they lean on one rein, because you always find when you analyse it, they don't turn well one way, they're heavier, delayed, or they bend their neck. And when you get the turns equal and the stop and go light, then the horse's head just melts into a nice position of comfort for the horse. And especially today, that's where we should be going, because we know so much more than we did about the effects of flexing the horse too round when the gullet is closed, and also the effects of nose bands that facilitate hyperflexion. And, these things are now pretty much repudiated now, but people still do those things, and the necks are often too short. So that's quite inspiring for me.
Do you think it's the lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, lack of education that people go off in the wrong direction?
Yes, I think it's definitely true. I think we do need more knowledge. The more knowledge I've gained, and most of the things that I did that were successful in my horse career, with particularly eventing, but also show jumping and dressage, were all done before I really knew, in a kind of explicit sense, how horse training works. I kind of knew it, like many good riders, implicitly, where I had a feel and I could do things, and things sort of happened, but they didn't always happen easily for me, I must say. And some horses didn't seem to want to do it. And there were also other, issues. I found it difficult to extrapolate riding to in-hand work. And what I mean by that is I never really took any notice of in-hand where horses would lead relatively well. If not, you could, pull them a bit harder and then they might lead well. But often they would tow you around and all of those sort of things. But when I started to understand equitation science, that's where I really started to see that, and there's quite a lot of evidence since too that's been published showing that in hand and under saddle are mirrors of each other. It's not two different horses, and one really helps the other. So there's a lot we can do in hand. And so for me, the education side is really vital. And I actually think that we're not far away from making it compulsory that if you're going to own animals, you need to know something about them, because it's not really fair to know nothing or assume things that are wrong and then go ahead and tackle training. It's just much safer as well to know something. And of course, if someone's already got great implicit skills, they're just going to be even better at it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Tell us about the Pony Club curriculum, how it came about, how you got involved, and just a bit of an overview of what's in it first.
Right. Well, basically, the curriculum was a really dramatic change, which has upset a lot of people. I think actually change, when it's sort of, revolutionary like that, isn't easy to accept, and I fully understand that. In the States where I was able to roll it out myself personally with with people watching, so I could demonstrate, it actually came across more easily. But unfortunately, at that time, that's when the pandemic came, and I couldn't, for example, go to Queensland or New South Wales. So it's been a bit slower there for people to cotton onto it. But it is really just the story of the horse. It's so great for kids to learn. There's a little bit about the evolution of the horse, but it's all intertwined into how the horse's mind works, how he learns, and how the horse moves, and how you integrate that. And it's not really tossing everything out that we already knew, but it's laying all the parts out on the table and starting from afresh to teach the horse what he needs to learn to be safe for him and safe for us in terms of stop and go and turn. And, basically when you think about it, every single horse sport, there's really nothing new. Every single horse sport's based on horses being able to stop and go, turn the front legs or turn the back legs. And of course, there are other subtle things like bend, which is a little bit misunderstood. It's a little different from a scientific perspective, because it's not just lateral bend. When horses bend, they're not good at lateral bending, but it's also axial rotation, where it's more of a twist in the body, where the belly and ribcage swing away, giving the rider the feel of bend. Nonetheless, that's a subtlety, and so is lateral flexion. But apart from those things, everything else is about that. So even the highest movement, for example, like piaffe or passage, are really in the gait of trot, because they're 2-beat movements, and the steps are really very much shorter, and the tempo is also slower, but not too slow. And so being able to alter the tempo and the stride length and do them separately is a really big advantage. And so the Pony Club curriculum is essentially about how you would start kids off from the very earliest level, just saying, how does your pony stop? Can you stop the pony in 6 steps or 4 steps even, or maybe even 3, so that it's still smooth? You don't want them to skid to a halt, but so that it's rhythmical and smooth. And does your horse go straight away, or what does he do? And how does he turn? And there's so many great instructors, even at the Pony Club where my grandchildren go in Merricks down here on the peninsula. There's some great teachers there that are doing things that I hadn't even thought of on the curriculum, showing great ways to teach kids stop and go and turn and to be safe. And from those basics with a little kid, then you just build on it and gradually you develop it more so that right at the highest level, at B and A test level, they're able to do everything that we would want them to do in any horse sport. And also we've fashioned it so that the end of the A test and the B test, but particularly the A, is like a gateway to any employment where they would be really valued in a race training yard, to ride horses for people, to do whatever. It's a really great thing. In fact, also kids that do their B test would actually pass year 12 psychology. They'd need a bit more things as well, but I know that that's true because much of the elements of the B test are really the fundamentals of operant conditioning.
That's wonderful, isn't it?
I was going to say, I got a bit sidetracked. I was going to say how it came about. Uh, and it really just came about because of my passion with getting people to learn more about this. And I kept thinking that the best way to get this across to people is with the young, because when you teach people when they're older, it's certainly not harder for people to learn when they're older. That's a bit of a fallacy. But there are more obstacles in the way. They're often protective about what they know. And when ideas, and this is a kind of fascinating notion, but when ideas are based on sort of fuzzy knowledge, then people actually hang on to them harder because there's an element of insecurity and sort of cognitive dissonance involved. And so they fight a bit harder. So, whatever the ways and reasons, it is easier to start with children. And so, somebody who came to us for some lessons at the AEBC years ago was at a really high level and noticed that in business and noticed that there was an opening for a board member. And she said to me, why don't you apply for that? You should really do it. And I thought, oh gosh, this could be a big can of worms. But when I did, and I had the interview, and I was just absolutely stunned by the fact that Pony Club Australia, the national board, was a skill-based board. It wasn't just a representative board, which is, for me, a really great thing because people could understand the background and some of the complexities, even though none of them really understood learning theory from my perspective a lot. But we had some great people to work with. And in particular, our CEO, Catherine Ainsworth, really pushed hard and sometimes made herself a little unpopular because she pushed so hard to get this curriculum once it was there to get it going. But I'm not a great writer of children's books and things. I probably get too involved in the intricacies of it. And so my good friend Portland Jones, Dr. Portland Jones in Western Australia, I asked her, would you like to be involved in helping get this syllabus going? And so she was the one who really got cracking to put it all together. And my work was really about supervising and making sure it followed the lines and adding a few things here and there, especially as we headed towards B test, where the knowledge got more complex. Then I wrote much of that. And it was just a really good collaboration. And as I said, I couldn't have done it without the board being behind me. And that was over two lots of chair people, Carol Patterson and Heather Disher. So they were really very accepting of it. And it wasn't easy when it was first introduced. Of course, it was rather like what happens to me in Southeast Asia when I'm helping them with their elephant training. And of course, they're skeptical in a very big way because they say, well, you don't even have elephants in Australia except in zoos, and how much experience have you had? And I said, I understand the technology of training, and I can get you to do it way more efficiently than you can. And it's very much true. So they would stand there with their arms crossed, and Pony Club people did the same. So I get that body language. But after a while, when people start to see the sheer logic of it, and logic is a really beautiful thing when ideas naturally lead on to another, once people got the hang of the logic of it, it began to fill in a lot of gaps for many of the people, as it did for me when I first, I didn't come to this knowing anything, except I had a zoology degree and had a little bit of knowledge about animal behaviour, but that's about it. It was really my studies and my PhD in particular that just opened this whole world up to me of, wow, there's so much that can be done. And being a zoologist, I was also heavily into the things that zoology used to teach in animal behaviour, and that is that, some animals live in social groups, certainly horses do, and that there's a kind of social organisation. And people got really carried away with that and talked about the pecking order, which was first described for chickens back in 1927, and since been, reviled. They don't really see pecking orders so much when you look at animals closely. And so now it's understood that every horse knows its dominance or submission, if you want to use those words, with each other in the social group. But they don't know the relationship between the others and the others. So it's not a linear hierarchy. But even more importantly, it's also important to recognize that horses are only dominant for a resource, and they have different dominance patterns for different resources. And so they'll tend to be more dominant for one thing than another, but also their dominance waxes and wanes. Once they've had a fair amount to eat, they're less protective of their food generally. And of course, we only see horses if we're lucky, in pairs or groups of three. Some people have them in bigger numbers, and it's a great thing if they do. But nonetheless, the natural patterns of horses is that sort of thing. So I was teaching, because of my background in zoology, I was teaching a girl on a horse, and it was a difficult horse. This was at the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre. And so I was telling her horse is dominant and she needs to be the boss and all of those things. And her dad was listening to me in his car. He had the window wound down and he was looking like he was reading the newspaper, but obviously he was listening to what I was saying. And he came over to me. His name was Professor Kim Eng. He said, "Oh, look, you think my daughter's horse is dominant, do you?" And I said, "Yes, it's really dominant. It's pushing her all over the place." And he said, "I'm surprised you are seeing this like this." He said, "Haven't you started your PhD?" And I said, "Yes, I've just started, actually." And he said, "Well, you're a zoologist, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You zoologists are all the same. You talk about the hierarchy and this pecking order, but you assume that. You don't really know it." He said, "I'm surprised that you're not saying to my daughter, because it's barging her, that she should just teach it to lead straight and simply think of it as a teaching exercise to teach the horse to lead straight." I was implying all of this other stuff, as many people still do. I just suddenly felt it all melt away really rapidly, and I felt embarrassed to even take any money. And I said, "Oh, who are you?" And he said, "I'm Professor Eng from Monash University. I'm the Professor of Experimental Psychology." And I said, "I think I could use you," because my other two supervisors were animal behaviourists, and which was all good and well in those days, but they're again more from a zoology veterinary background, not really understanding learning. And he didn't become a supervisor, but I had regular meetings with him at his place on a Friday evening. And he just changed my world by teaching me all, like he gave me psychology 101 and 202. It was just amazing. And it changed. My PhD would have been entirely different had I not had that great experience. So that was how I came about it. And, that's why I can understand all the different backgrounds that people have.
Andrew, when was this? What year was this that you started, that this happened, this incident? And what year did you graduate?
Well, I did my PhD quite recently, really. I finished in 2005, but I began in 1995. It was a 10-year PhD because I was full-time managing the Equine Behaviour Centre. I just started doing interstate clinics. I had 2 or 3 horses at top level that I was eventing. My life was big. I had 3 children by 1995. And, Warwick is 10 years older than Alistair, who's the youngest, and Sophie's in the middle. And so I had, quite a big life. And so I just, with this PhD, I just did it as much as I could in every spare moment. And so I began in 1995, but when I met Kim Eng, that was in 1995. So, sometimes I think it's amazing how you can be really lucky. And I think in my life, I've been lucky. I've stumbled across so many things without meaning to, and it's just been so fortunate that I did. But probably many of our lives are like that if you stop to see it.
Yeah. For people listening, right at the very point that Andrew started talking about pecking order, I think if you go back to that and listen to the part where it's the horse's individual relationship with each other, sort of discounts the whole chook pecking order theory. But there's something else, Andrew, and I'm not sure if I've talked to you about this on a podcast or off a podcast, but around about that time, while you were still doing your PhD, so it wasn't published, wasn't well known, you were coming up to Queensland and doing a couple of clinics. And there was a particular rider that was sort of just verging into sequence changes, okay? And she was taught by a quite well-respected, I don't want to go into any names, but an FEI judge. And she was being taught by this particular FEI judge who was a coach educator, so she was an educated coach herself and was educating others and teaching FEI riders. This particular horse that she was riding had problems with the sequence changes. It was fine when it was just doing the individual changes, problems with the sequence changes. And I think the first lesson, it came into the arena and, you sort of said, show me, and it went across the diagonal. Horse just took off. And you got the girl to walk and just continually go and canter across, start. The moment the horse got anxious, got upset, started to move too far forward, it was just walk, simple change. And you did this multiple times through the sessions, and just wonder if it was the first time. Anyway, there was this particular person who was there with her arms crossed, this is my student and what does he know? And at one stage, I think, and the horse started to settle down and was going quite kindly. And the horse, at one stage, you had said, and now quietly asked for a single change, round X, around the middle of the arena, and the horse walked. And she said, so I told you this was no good. This horse is not doing changes. Anyway, I had her arms crossed again. And then, just went around, came back again, played around with the horse a little bit. And just at the very end of that particular session, the horse just did a lovely change, came across the arena quietly, kept the rhythm, going really nicely, lovely change. And then went across the arena, and then we sort of, we just walked, finished the session. And at the end, she said, like this, not very much believing it. But I understand, and that was before you actually had anything published about learning theory. So, I think going through this and having the feedback and having the, you're saying it politely, people crossing their arms, I think there's quite a lot of resistance to new things. It takes people quite a while to go through and get new ideas.
Yes, and it's interesting, that example of the teaching the changes. See, I always say to people in my workshops, no matter what level they're riding, look, I'm a broken record. I really only talk about and work with stop and go and turn, and then you can do your thing and you can see that the problem will be solved by getting stop and go and turn in self-carriage and from light aids. And so an example of the changes, I helped Anke van Grunsven years ago but this was after I'd started to learn about, so this is about 2000 and something, and she was riding a horse. I think was it something black, painted black, or maybe it was Cracksea. I helped her with a few horses, and one of them in particular had problems with changes because it would just, the canter to one side would actually get really strong and run, and the canter to the other side was late, which is really characteristic of the laterality of horses. That's, many horses start like that, where they're late behind in one change. But anyway, I simply did down transitions, and so I got her to be able to do not only, it's the easy ones like walk to halt, but also trot to halt and then canter to halt within a really narrow time frame. And actually, a trainer called Tom DeRidder, who's also my son's trainer in Germany, strangely and coincidentally right now, because my son's doing Grand Prix dressage. But anyway, Tom DeRidder taught me this technique. The horse should stop within 6 beats, and then I would do canter again. That technique of halting, and it's not, if you pulled hard on the horse's mouth, that wouldn't be fair. But it's really just closing your fingers, using your seat as well, and getting the horse to halt within 6 once he's cantered. And all those downward transitions really help horses that tend to run. And that's the most common problem I find, that horses get hot and hollow and run in a change. So you can do a canter change and then halt, and a canter change and then halt. Maybe this day I did too many, I don't know. But the point is, it would have definitely helped the change get soft, because as soon as horses run, their back goes hollow, they brace their neck, and they use their lower jaw and teeth on the bit to escape the problem, whatever they perceive it to be, because that's what running is. And so getting it to be light too, the stop is really important. And then when you do that, then you find you've also got to get them a bit lighter to go, because as one diminishes, the other one sometimes does too. You often see that with stop and go. They're a little bit interrelated. And then I work on the go button too, get that sharp, and that helps the change, especially because the new change in a flying change comes from the outside hind leg, and sometimes you've got to stimulate that to actually go immediately, not to wait for a stride or a step. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Everything boils down. That's what I love about it. I've never yet seen a sport, and I worked in USA with Western horses and Canada, and working equitation horses in Europe and all over the place. And everything goes down to a problem in stop and go. And if we actually really privileged stop and go and turns to be light and in self-carriage, so that when you gave the horse an aid, with an invisible one in the end, the horse complied and stayed doing what you asked him to do until you asked another thing. And that's a beautiful way to ride a horse. It's a safe way to have a horse. And whatever we do now, whatever people think is the best way for competition horses should go, well, this is how it will be, because it's the only really evidence-based way, an ethical way, is to privilege self-carriage and lightness. It's got to be like that. So it means that self-carriage really does mean that if you gave the reins away for 2 strides, the horse shouldn't change anything, not change speed, gait, tempo. And when I say speed, I mean as in stride length and tempo, or line, or straightness in the body, or outline. Nothing should change when you give him the aid, and he should stay doing it until told otherwise. And it's just so important to have self-carriage so that they keep doing what you ask them to do. And it just makes horses, I'm glad you mentioned safety, because it is a safer way to have a horse. And if as soon as they get stressed, horses like us have 3 major coping mechanisms. So we either fight, or we run away, or we shut down. And some horses go to shut down faster than others, but mostly they go through active coping mechanisms first, where they try to run or they fight. And the fighters are really hard, to ride. The average person can't. They go to a specialist. But horses that run tend to get tense. But none of those coping mechanisms they shouldn't be there, because if we train them well from the very start to be in self-carriage and to operate from light aids, we'd be right. And if we just therefore open the gullets up and really let the horse be in a position that he chooses to be, and if he's well trained, he'll choose the ideal position, which is the one we want in front of the vertical, but he'll choose it. What we should be judging and what we should be rewarding is the people who can do those things.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to change the subject just a little bit to horse welfare. And we talk a lot about the 5 domains on the podcast, just different things come up and the importance of them. But you were part of the team that co-authored in 2020. Do you want to tell us a bit about how you came and what changes and, what you've sort of implemented there?
Yes, well, see, my early work was in learning theory, and
Yes.
And so I got fairly criticised that, myself and Paul McGreevy particularly, because we did a lot of these papers together. And people started to say after a period of time, well, that's all good and well, but there's just so much more than learning theory that explains horses. What about the bond we have between them and all of those things? And Paul and I had a good chat about it and recognised that there were really three areas that were missing that we needed to add to this mix. And they were, in scientific terms, they were attachment theory, arousal, because not much work's been done on arousal. In fact, I've just been involved in a PhD thesis as an examiner in the UK, in Nottingham Trent, which was about arousal and how we can measure it and whatever. And the other one is affective states. That is, the horse's feeling of your glass half empty, your glass half full. And that's according to their previous reinforcement history. So if they've had a life of a bit of confusion, they don't know what the bit means, or they don't know what the leg means, or sometimes the bit means slowing, but sometimes it means shortening your neck or coming rounder. Sometimes it means this or that. That's confusing. And so the more confusions we have, the more we start stabbing holes in the leaky bucket of security. And in the end, the horse can be so messed up that he just, shuts down into passive coping mechanisms. And we don't want that. And that, I'm not saying that's common, but that can be an outcome. And I think every horse that we train, no matter how good we are, there's going to be some elements that are somewhat confusing. But if we can give a horse a good life, that's what it's all about. So I really recognize with my work with horses and elephants, because it's the same thing, I work with difficult elephants as well as young ones, that a messed up elephant or a messed up horse, messed up life is really bad for them. And that can also impact their mental security forever, just as it can with humans. We can be really messed up by our early life and not easy to escape those things. So I was also fascinated in learning theory by this new science called welfare science. And Professor Mellor in New Zealand had, with a really great team, Kat Littlewood and Niall Beausoleil, and they had a great team there, and they developed the 5 domains model. It had a few iterations. And I went to a presentation that Professor Mellor gave, and so I said to him, but what about, it's good to have all of these domains, but the behavior domain doesn't really include human-animal interactions. It doesn't include what we do to horses or what we do to elephants or dogs or whatever. Not enough, because bad training. And we should talk about training and learning in this model. And we had a very good discussion. We went to the back for lunch so we could really thrash this out. And then the next morning he rang me and said, I think you're onto something there. I think let's do it. Let's write a new version. And I was just so excited to do that. And also I was really impressed with Professor Mellor's, as a scientist and as human, not to be able to let go of something that he had crafted, because a lot of us, and this is true for some scientists too, once they have an idea, they almost don't want it to be proven wrong. And yet it's great to be proven wrong. It's great to move on. So that's how that came about. And so then we got together a good team, and I wanted to get Paul McGreevy on my side because he's such an outstanding academic, and also Christina Wilkins, because she's also outstanding in her writing skills and her analytical skills as well. So that's what we did. And so they had the New Zealand team and they had our team, and we all did it together, and we came up with this. And it's been a really amazing document, this 5 domains, this 2020 version, because it's had now over 100,000 downloads, which is just unheard of in scientific areas. It's amazing. So it's been adopted by the International Federation of Horse Racing. It's been adopted by many zoos and all sorts of organisations, Racing Victoria. So I'm really, really pleased to see that that's happening, because really, although we can talk about the negative aspects of bad welfare, we often fail to mention the positive aspects of good welfare. And for a trainer, there's no doubt that you could get much more easy response in whatever sport you do, to the point where the horse can still manage it. you could do it much more efficiently, and you'd get more horses to be able to do it if we only understood the mechanics of how it all works, and also recognizing that, and this is what has really come into my radar in more recent years, is that what welfare really is. And apart from the training side, which I've talked about, the other side of the coin is the management side. And I certainly was guilty of this years ago myself. I had my horses in stables. Of course, I had a grill where they could see each other like everybody else did, and that seemed to be sufficient. And I'd give them a sheaf of hay in the morning and a sheaf of hay at night and that sort of thing, and plenty of exercise and a good diet. And I thought, that is welfare. But if that isn't welfare, that's part of welfare. But the most important things in welfare, there's a few standout things. And apart from the exercise thing and sort of having some freedom, and Australian horses can often do that in paddocks, even in yards with their shelters so they can even roll. But the other things are social opportunities and foraging. And social opportunities is not just where they can see each other. Social opportunities is about being able to touch. And that is just so important. And I guess something that I didn't think about, even though I knew in human psychology that the lack of touch and isolation is the single most important common factor in all mental disorders. So it's big. And yet we isolate horses because I guess we thought seeing is enough, but seeing isn't enough. So opening the tops of the stables is so valuable. And I did this with the Manchester Police, and I'd done so much training with them and everything seemed to be going, but we still had horses that were scared of drains and scared of bobcats in the city and all those sorts of things that police horses see in London and Manchester. And so I suggested, why don't we do just a pilot study, because you've got over 100 horses here, let's just do a few and pull down the tops and see if that helps, because the theory told me that it should, but that's all I had to go on, except for my own observations in my life, but they're small compared to doing a big study. So they had a meeting and they came back and said, we're going to pull them all down, the whole lot. And I said, oh, really? And I suddenly panicked and thought, oh, geez, I hope this works, because I was hoping just to do a pilot study. Anyway, they did that. And I said, okay, well, look, please tell me. I want to know the bad with the good. I want to know if it was complete failure, because that's valuable and important to know. And please let me know after 1 week and then after 6 weeks and see how things go. And after 1 week, there was a lot of ruckus because horses hadn't been used to being able to touch each other. And they also found out that some horses didn't like being next to certain horses, so they rearranged them. But after 1 week, there were massive improvements. And for example, horses that were scared of bobcats or drains, gutters, because some of them surprisingly don't even want to go over a gutter. They'll skid sideways and leap over it and all those sorts of things, showing they're quite scared of it, or else they balk entirely. And so all these things improved, and so they were really pleased to tell me that. And it was such a giant leap. And then I was working in Laos with elephants, and I talked to Michael Vogler, who has the elephant sanctuary there and a conservation centre with elephants that have been rescued from various places. So our organisation, our charity here in Australia called the Human Elephant Learning Programs Foundation, we funded a little bit of money for fencing, and it gave the elephants from being penned up and chained by the leg for all their lives, they had massive opportunities now to go into this big paddock with a forest in it, with a waterfall, and now people go there to have an experience just watching elephants at night instead of feeding them, which was the next step after other things that elephants had to do for tourists. When they stopped riding, the next thing to do was feeding elephants. And now the way ecotourism is going, you just go to a place where you're above the elephants and you can see day and night how they behave, which is actually way more interesting, worth doing. And many places have these sort of facilities. But I guess the point is that, and the elephants had the same thing there. The first week was noisy, and after that, they were much, much safer with people than they were. There was no, unreliable aspect of them because their world was predictable and controllable, which are the two big buzzwords in behavioral psychology. That's all we all want in our lives, is predictability and controllability of the things that we want and the things we want to avoid.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing lately as far as publishing.
All right. Well, I think this is about my seventh or eighth book. And I realized with the way things were moving and the new things I was learning, that previous books were not totally redundant, but I'd moved on and I know more about it. So I felt the need to do that. But also for the International Society for Equitation Science, and Paul McGreevy and myself were co-founders of that organisation.
Just hold off for a sec before you tell me about the book. Tell us a little bit about ISIS, or the International Society of Equitation.
Yes, well, okay. Yeah, because the book arose from principles that are on that website that we put in there. But the society itself just arose because I was presenting at a conference in Italy about looking at a different way of approaching horse training using learning theory. And I had a lot of people there because it was an animal behaviour congress. It was the International Society for Applied Ethology Congress in Italy. And so 30 odd people came and said, "Oh, this is really interesting. We need a science." And we all got together the next year in Scotland at another conference and had our first meeting and wondered what we would call ourselves. And it was all like-minded scientists who own horses, love horses and whatever. And so then the very first symposium we had was at my place here in Victoria. It's not mine anymore, the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre. And I built a lecture room for 40 odd people because I thought with this first symposium, I can't imagine more than 40 coming. In the end, we had 96 people arrive from 6 different countries. So we had to put a tent in the indoor arena, a really big marquee, and do all our presentations in the tent, which was fun. But every year we've had a conference as this society has grown in different countries every year. And it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And actually this year in New Zealand, it was sponsored by the FEI, and World Horse Welfare, which was really big for us to, as a scientific organisation, to have the recognition that our work, which is all published in scientific journals, is respected.
And where's the next conference?
The next conference is in Colorado next July.
Okay, and the website, on Horse Chats, and people know that they've just got to go to horsechats.com, search for Andrew, search for McLean, not get Jono, who's Andrew's brother, because John has done quite a few chats as well, but search for Andrew McLean.
I was going to say, you could have Jono. He's always up for a chat.
Yes, he's been very good. I think we've done, I don't know, must be close to 20 chats. We've done quite a few, and he did email me recently and say we haven't caught up for a while, so I'm hoping, is he going to Equitana?
No, I don't think he is. No.
That's okay. I'll put it on my to-do list to catch up with him afterwards then, and carry on with those chats, because they've been pretty popular.
Yeah, I can imagine. He's a really good teacher, actually. He's just amazing. He's a good teacher for anybody, but with children, I couldn't believe it, because he used to teach at our clinics at AUBC, and kids would, they'd say, "When's John's lessons?" And it was say, "Yeah, well, I'm teaching as well." But no, it was really great. It was really great for John. So he's really when he's with children, he's like a big child. He just gets right in the groove.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll put the domain on your page for this chat, but just tell us again that domain for the conference in Colorado.
I think it's www.equitationscience.com. I hope I've got that right.
That's okay. We'll make sure that we get the right one and put it in, and that's to do with the conference in Colorado.
Yes, and when you scroll down on the menu, there's conferences, and it shows up in the coming conference in Colorado. And so, getting back to the
book,
the book and how that came about. Well, in ISIS, we had developed these training principles, 10 training principles, which are on the ISIS website.
And I think if you go back to one of your earlier chats, we've talked about those 10 training principles.
Oh, good, yeah. And so when I wrote this new book, I wanted to write it entirely based on the 10. So it's actually each chapter is one of the 10 principles. So that was the first volume, which is the theory, which I think theory really has to inform practice. It's not the other way around, because otherwise you only justify what you did and we'd still be in caves. So as we know more, we should do better. And so I wrote that about the principles in the first volume, and then the second volume, which I've just finished actually yesterday, with the great help from Nikki Stewart and Sophie, my daughter, we got that cracking, and so that's about the practice of it. So it's really stop and go and turn, how that develops into whatever you want, and yielding hindquarters as well, including that, and how that moves us into to have a horse that's capable of doing any sport and moving straight on to start getting involved in those sports. I think it's the same principles, whether it's a racehorse or a working equitation or a dressage horse or a jumper. Those basic things, they don't just help a lot, they're actually critical for the horse too.
Is there anything that I should have asked you, but I haven't? Anything else any other messages that you've got?
The only one is the one that I did forget when I talked about the basic needs of the horse and how that also impacts the horse. And I mentioned social opportunities, and then I got carried away with the example. But there's also, and I mentioned, the horse, the ability to move and have some freedom and etc. Exercise. But I didn't go into foraging, and that's also important because when you enable horses to actually fossick for food and just chew and munch, so they don't have to chew much, they just have to be looking for food, and like a slow hay feeder, for example. So there can be a lot of work just involved in getting a small amount, but that's really good mental welfare because that's what they do. That's how they're wired for so many millions of years, 60 odd million in nature. They've got this massive wiring that we've been unable to change with selective breeding. And not that it matters, but it just shows how strong it is to graze, and they're herbivorous, and they evolved in Eurasia on the steppe region, which is not green and grassy areas like in Europe and here in the wet places. It's relatively dry, and so they just have to chew. They eat on average 13 hours a day. And so they have evolved that wiring to need to do it. So when we stop them doing it, that's why we see stereotypical behaviours of wood chewing, wind sucking, and or to some extent stereotypies like weaving. That's also caused a little bit by the lack of social opportunities as well as foraging. But yes, so foraging's another really big one that I'm trying to convince racehorse people to do that as well down here, to say, just use a slow hay feeder. But if the horse is mentally in a good place, sure, you're going to get the best out of him. It's a really terrible world if the animals we use in sport only can do it because they're suffering. We've got to do it where our best hope is that we're doing the best for them and they're as happy as they possibly could be in that situation. And so then the other one is the ones I mentioned, just training well, prioritizing lightness. And that just comes about through transitions. That's one of the great things I got from Kira Kirkland, is when I asked her one day, how many transitions should you do? And she said, thousands. And she meant it, probably not literally, but in other words, people don't do enough transitions. And so many top riders talk about that, about doing a lot of transitions, because the transitions themselves train the rhythm in between, in the sense that if the horse is running, you focus on more downward transitions in shorter amounts of steps progressively as he gets good at it without any stress. And if he's a little bit on the lazy side, as as the term goes, then you would focus on more sharper upward transitions. And those things, the rhythm is, what is in between. And if we can actually get that in self-carriage from light aids, and we've given the horse opportunities with his friends and foraging and plenty of exercise, plus a good diet and all the veterinary things that are needed to enable his physiological health, we cannot do better.
Andrew, when are you speaking about Pony Club at Equitana? You know the day, the time?
No, I don't, sorry. I've got this elephant training camp coming up next week. We're in Southeast Asia where we've got a really big one coming. It's the first time we've invited two mahouts from every country that has, or actually the 6 countries, not every. We did invite others, but we've got mahouts from 6 different countries coming with translators, and it's been a really epic thing. So getting that going. So Equitan is still in my inbox.
Well, if people are interested, they'll look at their schedule anyway. And I do say to people, don't just listen to us on the podcast because things can change, and have a look at the updated schedule. You'll find Andrew. And I just think it'd be very interesting to, I'm sure you go into a lot more detail there than what you have with me because I keep asking you questions about everything else. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you for coming on. And I look forward to chatting with you again sometime soon. And I will follow up with John or after Equitana.
Thanks a lot, Glenys. I appreciate it very much.